The conventional view of the media's role during the Vietnam War goes something like this. A crusading force of anti-establishment journalists told average Americans what the state wasn't telling them about the war's progress. Biased news coverage then seeped into people's living rooms in the world's first television war, radically shifting public opinion against the state and causing the government to withdraw under public pressure. The thing is, though, this isn't entirely accurate, and it's important to know why. Welcome to Intrigued Mind. Today, we're looking at the evolution of the media's role in the Vietnam War, qualifying levels of bias in the American press, and questioning just how impactful the media was in shaping public opinion. At the start of the Vietnam conflict in the late 1950s, the media played a relatively inconsequential role. American audiences were not that interested in foreign affairs, least of all in Southeast Asia, and most news reports usually focused on domestic issues. But when the conflict heightened as a result of increased Viet Cong aggression in 1959 and 1960, news stories became more popular as they appealed to a heavily anti-communist population. As a result, leading news companies like the New York Times and Newsweek sent journalists to Saigon to cover events. Despite the press's interest in the conflict, diplomatic and political factors shaped the need for secrecy. See, U.S. involvement in the region at the time was confined to financial and political aid to the South Vietnamese regime, but U.S. presence was in breach of the 1954 Geneva Accords. The number of policy advisors present was way over the limit of what was allowed, and what's more, the U.S. was propping up a dictatorship that was refusing to hold free elections. Kennedy worried that this would provide fuel for propaganda in the communist world, as well as stirring up criticism back home. He therefore instructed Saigon news officers to limit military and political information and adhere to the press restrictions of Ngo Dinh Diem's dictatorial government. This was also strategic to maintain good relations. Any news reports on human rights abuses and a repressive state could jeopardize the flow of information from South Vietnamese intel sources and disrupt U.S. regional strategy. The media would therefore be completely neutral, and the U.S. Embassy purely there on advisory and aid capacities. By and large, reporters initially stuck to the official line given by news officers. It was only when inconsistencies appeared between official stories and the actual events when a minority of reporters wrote about them. A minority of skeptical journalists like Homer Bygard from the New York Times and Francois Solly from The Times also befriended press officers and commanders who leaked information. The journalists wrote damaging stories about the South Vietnamese regime. Their condemnations of the political and military weaknesses of the dictatorship, with criticism sometimes extending to the U.S. government, put the U.S. Embassy at direct odds with Ngo Dinh Diem's cabinet, which insisted on deporting the two journalists. It seemed like Kennedy's self-serving respect for the regime's media restrictions backfired. However, this was a minority of journalists, and most not only followed the official line, but also supported government intentions. They were part of a generation that grew up in post-war America, after all, and rarely challenged the wisdom of U.S. intervention to halt the spread of communism across the world. Cold War ideology meant that many, for example, never considered that North Vietnam might actually have wanted to reunite with South Vietnam following their recent division after World War II. Instead, the North Vietnamese war effort was seen as the works of a communist conspiracy led by China and the Soviet Union. As the war escalated and the cover-ups became more and more obvious, the skeptical minority began to widen. Stricter restrictions under Lyndon Johnson caused uproar and aggravated the media's relationships with government and military elites. Newsmen in Saigon were banned from canteens and service clubs at the military base, as well as from the main airbase unless escorted. Official guidelines for news reports became stricter, with reduced word limits, and even question and answer courses on what constituted light, moderate, and heavy losses. More journalists turned to unofficial sources when it became clear that the official accounts in the daily briefings, mockingly dubbed the 5 o'clock follies, were incomplete or blatantly distorted. Yet, journalists who spoke out against the inconsistencies were branded as unpatriotic and detrimental to the war effort. In 1965, CBS newsman Morley Safer reported that Operation Search and Destroy was rather just Operation Destroy, revealing that American troops had torched 150 peasant huts. Having deviated from the official line, which was that their destruction was prompted by gunshots from the village, the reporter faced the wrath of the military that tried to ban him from their area of operations, as well as that of President Johnson, who called CBS and accused them of shitting on the American flag. Incidents like these have leveraged the view, one surviving to this day, that the media was biased against the army. Issues of competence, poor taste, or competitive self-interest did occur among some journalists, as well as exaggeration and embellishment. However, the distortion of facts was never as significant as with the official line given by military news officers. While more ground troops were being sent to Vietnam, news companies were reporting on abuses, use of napalm, and Agent Orange, as well as military setbacks. When the public became more and more skeptical of the war effort, the military needed a scapegoat. The government certainly could not reveal that it was distorting the facts to its people. Therefore, fingers were pointed, and as William Hammond put it, those most emotionally tied to the conflict fixed their anger on the press, the most visible element of society that appeared to have rejected them. At the same time, though, even the state elite had begun to seriously question the benefits of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, including members within Johnson's inner circle, who were eager to press for negotiation with the North Vietnamese at the risk of America losing face. In early 1966, members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee openly questioned the legality of American intervention in Vietnam. Amid genuine concerns of World War III, senators requested a clarification of U.S. policy before additional funds were approved for the war effort. When Johnson unexpectedly withdrew from the 1968 presidential campaign, the national elements who supported the war in Vietnam lost their primary spokesman. Within elite circles, it became acceptable to oppose the war. It's been said that this trend announced a turning point in war coverage, with the media following the establishment in what views were permissible to have and what news could be covered. At the same time, the Tet Offensive in 1968 was having an enormous impact. This was a series of coordinated North Vietnamese attacks on villages and outposts throughout South Vietnam, coming on the heels of Defense Secretary Robert McNamara declaring the war was close to an end. Not only marking a huge escalation in the conflict, it was a watershed moment in media reporting. The failures of the U.S. Army and the realization that the conflict was reaching stalemate gave way to great pessimism across the American news media. Though still under regulation from the military, the media became much more critical of the war effort. This did not necessarily mean less patriotic or anti-war, even if this was often the accusation levied by the military. Boston Globe surveyed that out of major U.S. cosmopolitan newspapers, 7 had shifted from support to criticism. In 1968, Life published "Wherever We Look, Something's Wrong," referring not only to Vietnam, but the domestic issues that plagued America in the late 1960s: pollution and crime in cities, the assassination of Martin Luther King and ensuing race riots, and the Kent State shootings, not to mention the slide of the dollar from the war deficit and the cultural counter-protests. News reports became more editorialized, soaring from a pre-Tet average of 5.9% to 20%. With the emergence of more investigative journalism commenting on drug abuse, racial tensions, and reports on military disobedience, a shift in journalistic style took place. Many journalists covering the infamous Battle of Hue followed the troops. The New York Times hugely exaggerated an American defeat with gory imagery and phrases like "inch by bloody inch" and "foot by blood-soaked foot." Investigative journalism led to revelations on the My Lai massacre, which revealed the discrepancies between the official presentation of the war and reality. Whereas the 1968 Operation Search and Destroy was initially reported a success for the U.S. Army, it was later revealed that the task force in question, guilty of rape and abuse of power, killed 350 South Vietnamese civilians. The Vietnam War is also well known for being the first television war. As General Westmoreland wrote, war was literally piped into the living room, bedroom, and kitchen of most Americans. By the fall of 1967, 90% of evening news was targeted toward the conflict, with an estimated audience of 25.3 million households. Footage was more graphic after the Tet Offensive, showing wounded soldiers, gunfights, and other war scenes, though historians question the real impact television had on shaping public opinion. According to a study by the National Association of Broadcasters in 1969, to assess if television news provided an important source of information for the American public, less than half of those watching were paying attention. Of 232 viewers who were asked what they recalled from that night's broadcast, 51% failed to recall a single story out of an average of 19 that had appeared. It was certainly a different era of news reporting, and this might have impacted how it was received in households. Footage was also relatively tame as it complied with military rules, which limited the broadcasting of extreme violence. Military and government officials, however, were of the belief that the television war was shaping public opinion. When CBS presenter Walter Cronkite famously announced in February 1968 that the conflict was mired in stalemate and saw little hope for a U.S. victory, President Johnson is rumored to have said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." By holding the state accountable for events that the military attempted to conceal from the public, the media was blamed for losing the war. President Nixon famously said, "Their worst enemy seems to be the press." This view survives in the memory of the Vietnam War. The unpatriotic journalists failed to rally around the flag and do as they were told. One thing for certain is that public protest in the United States forced Nixon to withdraw from Vietnam. However, the extent to which the media actually shaped public opinion still divides experts and historians. TET reporter Peter Braystrup said that the public made up its own mind about the war, irrespective of what the press said. One study showed that the greatest factor influencing public opinion was far from television news and footage, but increasing casualty rates reported in newspapers, notably with every 15% hike. Another study, by historian Daniel Hallen, found that 49% of all domestic criticism of government policy on the war appearing on television came from public officials, while only 16% came from reporters. The remaining 35% came from activists, soldiers, and members of the public. William Hammond claims that the media did not shape public opinion, but moved with the times, that public dissatisfaction and then opposition in the Senate allowed for critical journalism in the post-TET period. Ultimately, it became extremely difficult to disguise the realities of war from the people of a modern state. As Hammond puts it, the truth has greater ultimate power than the most pleasing of bromides. No amount of massaging will heal a broken limb or a fundamentally flawed strategy. And so, the endeavor for ever-expanding access to the truth soldiered on, and continues to this day. For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel, like the video, and leave your suggestions in the comments below.